Uh, Welcome to the second session of this mini course on Ideas 1. Professor Dahlstrom is going to address the topics that he announced yesterday, so I'll just let him speak.
Good, thank you. And thanks again for the invitation to be here. I've never been to Pisa before, so it's a really delight to be here. On Monday from 10 to noon, if any of you would like to talk to me for whatever reason, I'll be in Professor Ferrarin's office for those 2 hours. So,
if you're not aware of it, it's on the 4th floor, office 109.
So I've been at Boston University for too many years, 26 years. And if you have any interest in studying in the States or want to talk about that, that would also be happy to talk to you about that. I've also done a lot of work on Mendelssohn, and most recently, a lady philosopher, Edith Landmann-Kalischer, who has very interesting theories of art. Her basic, I guess, most interesting thing is she says that art is the picturing or mirroring of mental phenomena. So she did consider herself a phenomenologist, but more of a Brentanian. And she says, well, psychology studies mental phenomena too, but there's a way in which art presents mental phenomena to us, pictures it, imagines it. So that book has just come out about 4 or 5 months ago, and there are now starting to be workshops on. So anyway, if you're interested in early phenomenology or later Heidegger, those are also topics I've been working a lot on. Okay, so our last meeting, we went through the book that made Husserl famous, and that is the first volume of the Logical Investigations. It made him famous because people thought in general that he had made a strong case against psychologism. Okay, so psychologism is roughly the idea that if logic is a practice, it's based upon a normative discipline, and normative disciplines, norms presuppose facts or theories. So the question would be, what is the science of facts or theories on which the norms and then the practice of logic would rest? And it was popular in the late 19th century and early 20th century to say that science that grounds logic is psychology. And so what Husserl does in the Prolegomeni, as we saw last class, is try to show that that can't be the case. So generally speaking, logical principles are exact, not vague. If logic is based in psychology, they can't be exact. Logical principles are necessary. If logic is based upon psychology, they can't be necessary. Logical principles neither entail nor are entailed by any facts. If it's based on logic, there has to be facts that ground logic. So those are the 3 summary arguments at the end of the Prolegomena. So as I was thinking about our meeting last time, I realized I think I shortchanged a part of Husserl's argument that isn't necessarily only interesting for the question of logic and logical investigations, but it's a general argument about normative disciplines. So I thought I would just run it by you one more time. I don't know if I put this on the board quite this way. So the general idea is that you've got a practical discipline. That's a pretty straightforward translation, but he also uses the expression Kunstwerk. And the English translator of the logical investigations translates this technology. I don't think that's the best translation, but it's an interesting one because the practical discipline, the Kunstlehre, supposes, you might want to even say only if, but that might be too strong. I'm trying to make it as weak as possible. Okay? The practical discipline supposes the normative discipline. So there must be some norms according to which the practical discipline operates. That's the general idea here. But then the point is made that the normative discipline supposes a theoretical discipline. So you see what happens here. If we say that there's a right way to make inferences, there's norms as to what makes that the right way, but then that has to be based on some kind of theoretical discipline, supposedly. And psychologism is the view that psychology is that theoretical discipline. How many of you have a car? An automobile, right? An automobile. Do you own it? You have to take care of it? Yeah, okay, good. And if you don't, think of somebody who does. Okay. So what's the practical discipline here? Here's just, this is a very straightforward attempt to show how this might work. The practical discipline, the art of managing your car requires to change the oil regularly. Part of the art of managing your car. So then the question is, well, what is the norm for that? Well, the norm for that is it's good. We got to get that value word in there. It's good to change your oil regularly. Or you could say you should change your oil regularly. So good and should here, actually Husserl makes them equivalent. But that would be applying the norm or articulating the norm that then is the basis for the practical discipline. So the practical discipline says, do this, do that. So let's call that X. And the normative discipline says, X is good. What's the theoretical discipline tell you? Okay. Well, it's supposed to be the case that the normative disciplines, the evaluation, require what is evaluated, and what is evaluated is value-free. Okay. So value-free, what would it be with your engine? What? It's good to change your oil regularly. Why? Why is that good? What fact of the matter? Or yeah, it's pretty straightforward. Hmm? Right. So it's good to change your oil regularly because engines not let's see, lubricated sufficiently fail to function properly. Now, this is supposedly a fact. I think it is a fact. But it's an example of what Husserl has in mind when he says that the normative discipline requires a theoretical discipline. And of course, there's the practical discipline that is based on the norm. Right? And the argument for psychology is very simply that psychology is a theoretical discipline that underscores these other two. Now, what Husserl's argument was in the Prolegomena is that it can't be psychology And there are reasons for that we've gone through, but the theoretical discipline has to be pure logic, what he calls pure logic. And I won't try to go into that, but this was a rather common way of talking about the general methodology of the sciences. So it wasn't just inference, but general methodology of the sciences, pure logic. And pure logic is a priori and apodictic. So the theoretical science that underscores the normative discipline, then the practical discipline for Husserl is going to be pure logic. Do you have a question?
Oh, no.
Okay. Is that clear to everybody? So I think what's interesting about it, to forget logic for a moment, just think of the various normative disciplines, things that, the ways we try to articulate norms. What are the norms of a good life? Or what are the norms of a just political arrangement? What are the norms of a fair international economic situation? Do we have a similar situation here where we would go from the normative discipline, we would say something is good, then we would have to articulate that. That's at least a model that Husserl gives us for doing this. I think it's fairly interesting. This is the tough one, I think, actually. Where do the norms come from and how we articulate the norms? But at least the point he's making is that at least in some respects, it seems that the norms will depend upon facts or theories. Okay, is that fairly clear? Probably give you better examples than changing the oil in your car, but it is a practical discipline. There's a norm there, and there's a reason why you should change your oil regularly, why it's good to change your oil regularly. And that reason has no values written into it. It's just a description of the states of affairs. In all likelihood, the engine will overheat, as the gentleman said, or it won't function properly if it's not regularly lubricated. Okay, that was that. Now, the Prolegomena that we talked about last class, in which he criticizes psychologism, was, as I said, very well received. It was considered by many people a knockdown argument against psychologism, or if it wasn't considered that, it set forth some of the strongest arguments. And so if you're going to be a psychologist, you're going to have to contend with Husserl's arguments. So either way, if you agreed or disagreed, it was a tour de force at the time. So on this argument, logic is a theoretical, formal, and a priori science, independent of psychology. Now, in the Prolegomena, the first volume of the logical investigations, Husserl does not provide anything in the way of a positive account of how the ideal character of logical form is given, is entertained, or known. So this was you could say the critical part of the book was volume 1, the Prolegomena. Then he turns to volume 2. There are six logical investigations in which he tries to articulate the positive doctrine. The positive doctrine he describes at one point as a middle way between empiricism and the neo-conscience. But the second volume was not as well received as the first. And some, like Paul Nautorp, the famous neo-Kantian, who actually was, they knew each other and respected each other, he thought that Husserl had relapsed into psychologism in the sixth investigations. Okay? So the challenge will be there, is he making claims that ultimately would be claims made by psychology anyway and fall back into it? You could see that a Fregean might say, well, this is, you haven't really gotten past this psychological account of ideal structures. So you know, your criticisms will end up applying to you. Now, in Husserl's not completely innocent here, obviously. He calls the logical investigations a descriptive psychology in the first edition. And we saw last class that Brentano describes his psychology as descriptive psychology as opposed to genetic. We saw that Ernst Mach did that. Fender did that. So it was rather common at the time for those who were trying to understand the foundations of logic to appeal to something called descriptive psychology. But Husserl obviously thinks that what he meant by descriptive psychology had nothing to do with the kind of psychology supposed by the psychologistic interpretations. So what he understands by descriptive psychology or phenomenology, the logical forms do not consist in the experiences of thinking and knowing. The logical forms do not consist in the experiences of thinking and knowing. The form is distinct from thinking it. The form is distinct from knowing it. Okay, so it does not consist in the experiences of thinking and knowing any more than it does in the symbolism of the words alone. You don't like if P then Q, therefore Q. If A then B, A therefore B. The words don't matter. So we need to understand the logical forms as somehow independent of the thinking and the knowing, and also independent of the terminology, the words used. Okay. So Husserl takes back the term descriptive psychology in the second edition. I think it's 1913 or 1910, and calls it phenomenology. So what does he try to do in the 6 logical investigations? I'm going to put the titles of each of the investigations on the board and try to say something about each of them. I'm not going to be comprehensive. It's a 1,000-page book with the Prolegomena. But I want to get to the 6th logical investigation, which he considers the most important. His erstwhile student, sort of not really a student of his, but sometime collaborator, Heidegger, also thought that was the most important of the 6 investigations. Okay, so we'll go through that now. I hope that this will take about half our time together, and then I'll turn to ideas 1, continue a program we set up on the board last class. Someone in the class last time, I don't know if you're still here, mentioned Bolzano. Is that person here? No.
That was the new.
Oh, okay. So the first logical investigation, there's a bit of Bolzano in it. It's entitled Expression and Meaning. German Ausdruck and Bedeutung. Okay. So in this first investigation, the title Expression and Meaning, Husserl aims at establishing the ideal unity and content of meanings, in contrast to the linguistic formulations of them, as well as possible objects or reference of those meanings. So you could see this would be one of the first things you want to do if you're trying to articulate what logic is about. What is logic about? Is it about the expressions? Certainly in part is, but is it ultimately about how things are expressed, or is it about what is expressed, the meanings? So his first point here of emphasis is to establish this ideal unity in contrast to linguistic formulations of them, as well as possible objects or reference of those meanings. I can't help but think of Professor Ferrarin's work. He also wants to contrast it with accompanying images. The meanings are not the images. And to multifarious experiences of the meanings, different kinds of experiences of the meaning. So he distinguishes acts of meaning something which is absent, so meaning something in its absence, from manifestations, intimations, and betrayals of such acts, as well as from acts in which what is meant is present and perceived as such. So this is a very distinctive kind of consciousness, kind of mental act, the act of meaning something. When we talk about meanings, well, the word meaning is the result of an act of meaning something. And that's what he's focusing on here. A meaning conferring act, whether it betrays itself or not, transforms some physical content, such as the printed figures on this page, into expressive signs, carriers of meaning. So when you're reading, there's something physical there. I guess even if it's virtual reality, it's still something in a physical sort. And meaning is conferred on it by the act of using it to articulate some meaning. At the same time, Husserl distinguishes meaning itself from such acts. He has to do this because of the anti-psychologism. Psychologism would describe the meaning as tied up with the act, the meaning, and that's in space and time, and that's something which could be open to an inductive investigation. So he distinguishes meaning itself from such acts, as well as from its expression or imaginative illustration, conceiving it instead as a kind of ideal unity, a sine qua non of scientific objectivity and communicability. Now, there was an essay written around the turn of the century by Twardowski, who distinguishes act, content, and object. And Husserl adopts that language. So the act of meaning, there's the content of meaning, and there's the object which is reached by that content and act. So he elaborates the at once intentional and ideal character of meanings as the content in terms of which we refer to objects. That makes sense? The content in terms of which we refer to objects. So we want to distinguish the content of the mental act of meaning, the meaning itself, from what objects can be meant by that meaning. This is very similar, found in Wittgenstein, this way of talking about things. So he writes, in an assertion about a perception, as in any assertion, we distinguish between content and object, and indeed in such a way that under content is understood the identical meaning that someone listening, although not themselves perceiving, can also rightly grasp. So it's not only the objectivity that the meaning is ideal, but it also allows for communicability. In acts of meaning, we refer to objects by means of meanings, but the meanings themselves are not to be confused with those acts or with the objects to which they thereby refer. So this sounds a little bit like Bolzano's Satz an sich, propositions in themselves, as opposed to the sentences in terms of which those propositions are expressed, which would be the potentially the physical words, the physical symbols. Though it is the content of a signative intention, meaning has at the same time a unity and ideal character that transcends different actual acts of signifying in which it is put into play. So it is an ideal unity. We refer to it, we refer to things by means of it, but if the meaning itself is not collapsible into our act of meaning. That's the claim he's making here. It also has close affinities with Frege's semantic objectivism. So both Frege and Husserl can refer to the same object by means of different expressions, each with its own meaning. Superman and Clark Kent, or the victor at Jena. This is a classical example of the victor at Jena and the vanquished at Waterloo. The same Napoleon, right? But there's two meanings that pick out the same object. So we see this is a quote from Husserl, we see the essence of meaning not in the experience that conveys the meaning, but rather in its content, which displays an identical intentional unity in contrast to the multiplicity of actual or possible experiences of speaking and thinking. So you can see here that he's trying to get us to see the ideal unity that is associated with meaning and how it is to be contrasted with the ways it is expressed. And he obviously needs to do that to describe accurately, in his opinion, what goes on in logic. Okay? You know, let's take the simplest stupid example. You know, if P then Q, P, are these two? Do these two P's the same? No, this one's up there, this one's down there. But we confer the same meaning onto each expression. And if we didn't do that, we couldn't get that. We couldn't get if P then Q, P therefore Q. So there is this, the claim here is there has to be this ideal unity for logic to work at all. So we have to make sure we don't collapse the meaning into the acts of meaning or the ways those meanings are expressed, or even to the objects expressed by the meaning. These are just a couple of quotes. I'm translating from the German, so I may stumble a little bit, but he says, pure logic has, in fact, to do exclusively with ideal unities that we here call meanings. And insofar as we attempt to read out the ideal essence of meanings from the psychological and grammatical contexts, and thereby to clarify them. To the extent that we do this, we are already in the circuit of pure logic. And then a similar statement. If all given theoretical unity is essentially a unity of meaning, and if logic is the science of theoretical unity in general, then it is immediately evident that logic is the science of meanings as such, of their essential sorts and distinctions. So logic is the science of meanings as such. It's not a science of expressions. It's not a science of the acts of meaning. It's not a science of the objects meant. It's a science of meanings. And again, as he says, the types and distinctions among them, and then also the laws that under which they operate. Now, at the very end of the first logical investigation, he makes a claim which has a wider significance, perhaps, than just this concern with the logical context. But I think it's worth mentioning because this is a sense of phenomenology that I think has persisted long after Husserl. So he says towards the end, up till now, we have preferred to speak of meanings, which, as is the normal sense of the word, apply to meanings of expressions. But in itself, there is no necessary connection between ideal unities that function factically as meanings and the science to which they are bound, by means of which they realize themselves in the life of a human being. We can therefore also not maintain that all ideal unities of this sort are explicit meanings. Each case of a new formation of concept teaches us how a meaning realizes itself that previously had not been realized. Just as numbers, in the ideal sense presupposed by arithmetic, do not arise and pass away with the acts, so too it is with the ideal purely logical unities, the concepts, the propositions, the truth, in short, the logical meanings. They form an ideal, closed, inbegriff, summative concept of general objects relative to which how they are thought or whether they are thought and how or whether they are expressed is contingent, is irrelevant. There are therefore countless meanings which in the ordinary relative sense of the word are merely possible meanings while they never come to expression. So the meanings is a really rich notion for him. I think the idea that you could apply, you could have a phenomenology of gender, or you could have a phenomenology of technology, because there are meanings there that have to be elicited, that has to be articulated, under which these situations, these contexts are working, but haven't been brought to the fore yet. So there's a certain kind of promise here to his phenomenology that he sees with this notion of meanings. Are there any questions or comments about that? Okay. The next, I'm going to have less to say about the next one, but I do want you to hear about it. The next logical investigation is the ideal unity of the species. And modern theories of abstraction. Under modern here, you could, if you want to make notes for yourself, you could write empiricist. He takes on Locke, Hume, and Mill. And he shows that Locke, Hume, and Mill's attempt to come up with universals by way of a theory of abstraction has to suppose, in order to even get going, some kind of ideal unity of the species. So this investigation is a really powerful set of arguments against that empiricist tradition in dealing with universals, or with the ideal unity of a species, of a collection of things. So in the second investigation, he addresses this theme of ideal unity of a species by distinguishing that ideal unity from its extension. In the process, he criticizes various empiricist accounts. For example, Mill's account of conceptualization by way of abstractive attentiveness. That is to say, by way of turning attention from an individual object as a whole to one of its attributes. The problem with this account is, in Husserl's view, obvious. By directing our attention to that particular attribute, for example, the green color of a tree in front of us, we still have no information about the one identical attribute, the green as such, in contrast to its instantiations. Yet we plainly make meaningful and true assertions about the species that would be false and absurd to make about the instance, and vice versa. In this way, Husserl argues for the necessity of determining the ideal or specific unities in general. This is really an interesting investigation. It's pretty much Husserl's treatment of universals. He has what in analytic metaphysics today is called a trope theory. So the theory is that the universal is in the object itself as one of its properties or qualities, and there'll be a different one for each individual, but there'll be the same universal property or the same ideal unity in each one of them. The unity is supposed by the extension. The unity doesn't derive from the extension. So that's the trick there. That's all I have to say about that, unless you want to hear more or talk more about it. But I encourage you to read it. One semester I taught Locke, Hume, and Mill on universals and Husserl's arguments. And it was really an interesting class because he's very clear about this issue. I mean, it's an old-fashioned issue. How do you, when you're trying to abstract and say you want to extract quality P from A, B, C, D, how do you know that it's the same P each time? You already have to have the ideal unity to do the abstraction. So saying that all knowledge derives from experience of individuals, it's hard to say how that's going to work. So that's the general drift of the argument. I hope I'm not massacring it along those lines. Okay, the next logical investigation is Husserl's mereology, the doctrine of wholes and parts. So at work in the second investigation, we just talked about, in tandem with the central distinction between an ideal species and its multiple instantiations, is the distinction between abstract and concrete contents. The distinction between abstract and concrete contents issues, however, according to Husserl, from a more general consideration of parts and wholes. So that's why this term, this is often referred to as mereology. So the abstract would, generally speaking, would be a part of some whole. So in general, Husserl characterizes this issue as a problem for formal ontology. Now, if you're wondering what formal ontology is, if you could just bracket it for a half hour, because we're going to talk about it in ideas. But in general, it's the ontology that corresponds to formal logic, whatever your logical system is. And for those who know Wittgenstein better than Husserl, Wittgenstein has the same notion of formal ontology. So in the Tractatus, there's the name, and then there's the formal ontology would be the object, the proposition, the formal ontology would be the state of affairs. So it's something like that that's at work here. So he says that this discussion of parts and wholes is a key subject matter for formal ontology. Now, the most perhaps influential thing that Husserl introduces here, and it is a really complex theory, but the most interesting, or rather the most influential part of it, is the distinction he makes between independent parts, that is to say, parts that can be presented apart from the wholes to which they belong. And the word for those independent parts I get to ask you a question for translation purposes. So independent parts, the German is Stücke, which is best translated pieces. I used to work as a car mechanic a long time ago, so this is another stupid car example, but a car is a whole, the machine's a part, and a tire is a part. But you can replace the parts with those parts with other parts. Those are pieces of the car. Okay? But there's another kind of part which is non-independent. And the word German for this is momenta. In English, momenta, it would sound like it means the moment, the instant, but it doesn't. In this context, it doesn't. So the problem in translating, I was one of the first people to translate momenta as an inherent part, because I would find people just be confused if I use the word moment. What do you do in Italian?
I believe it is momentum.
They just use momenta.
Translators of Husserl in the 40s, 50s, and so on are aware of translations of Hegel's logic, where the meaning of moment is roughly the same. So I believe that.
Oh, that's a good.
It wasn't a particular problem.
Yeah.
For the Italian audience.
Well, that's fortunate. It is in English context.
Yeah, right.
It's a real problem.
No, but in Italian you can't say a moment, meaning something that is contained only ideally, something else.
Okay. Well, that gives us. Thank you very much, because it's a problem for my language, native language English, how to translate this. But more interestingly and importantly is there's two kinds of wholes here. There's wholes here in which the parts can only exist as parts of the whole. And there are wholes in which the parts can be taken away from it and still exist. That's a fundamentally different sense of a whole part relationship, a fundamentally different sense of mereology. This has some import for Husserl's account, because he wants to describe consciousness as a concretum, a concrete, and the abstractum would be the parts of it, but the parts only exist as part of that concrete consciousness. But then it does then apply to his phenomenology. Okay. It also, there would be a different kind of founding or grounding if the parts are completely dependent on the whole, as opposed to if they weren't. So the essential necessities are various kinds of necessary connections among momenta, non-independent parts in the formations of wholes. And those connections are supposedly corresponding to analytically a priori laws, domains of formal logic and formal ontology. Okay, so that's the whole part distinction. There's a great deal of formalism involved in that investigation, if you want to work through it. 4 is the distinction between independent and dependent meanings. So he's taking his doctrine of wholes and parts and the distinction between the two kinds of wholes and applies it immediately to meanings. That isn't the full title of this section, no. It is also called "And the Idea of a Pure Grammar." So a pure grammar is going to have to distinguish between independent and dependent meanings relative to different grammatical expressions, and that will be dependent upon this distinction between independent and dependent meanings. Again, there's a number of interesting aspects to this. This distinction, which he says is not psychology or empirical findings, underlies the grammatical difference between incomplete and complete expressions. So that's called traditionally syncategorematic and categorematic expressions. Okay, so the syncategorematic would be and, okay, would be an incomplete expression. Jack and Jill would be a complete expression. Okay. The difference between dependent and independent meanings also provides the foundation for a pure grammar that determines laws for combining meanings into meaningful complexes. Laws that supposedly are a priori apart from considerations of objective validity. So there's a lot at stake here. A distinction he introduces in this context. So one of his objectives is to distinguish not only meaning from meanings, but also to distinguish meanings or sense from nonsense, but also to distinguish nonsense from absurdity. Okay. And this is an interesting distinction. So let's, for the moment, say that meaning is the same as sense. And we would want to distinguish that from nonsense. For those who are studying Wittgenstein, all this talk about what is the meaning of nonsense. So Husserl has at least a wedge into this issue. So nonsense and then absurdity. For the German here, this would be Sinn. This would be Unsinn. This would be Widersinn. I don't have a formal definition of those two. I'm going to use an example to talk about it. So an example of nonsense would be the expression around 4. Could someone give me a comparable Italian? 3 words that the way they're put together make no sense because they're not put together in that sequence ever in ordinary Italian. Anybody?
The epoch, which is an objective or a connector.
Okay, great. So that would be Unsinn. Then Widersinn, or absurdity, would be something like all squares have 5 sides. Take the example, one of the German examples is a round square, or something, a wooden anvil or something like that. Okay. So this would be absurdity because it's contradictory in some way. This is just pure nonsense because you don't have a syntactically complete expression that you could then subject to a criterion like the principle of non-contradiction. So you got to be careful about your nonsense. Whether the nonsense is due simply to this or whether it's due, it really is absurd. Okay, so this leads him to a doctrine of simple and composite meanings, dependent and independent meanings, on the way to addressing the topic of laws of combinations of meanings. So this was his draft of an outline for what would be a pure logic, a pure grammar, sorry. Okay, So those are the first four logical investigations. Sometimes these four logical investigations are referred to as the Bolzano investigations, because there's so much of the echo of Bolzano in them. That's not Husserl's language. That's language of scholars of Husserl's work, like Daniel Dahl. But the next two investigations are, by contrast, sometimes referred to as the Brentano investigations. Okay? So the fifth investigation on intentional experiences and their content. This is the investigation that you would want to spend time on if you were doing philosophy of mind. Because here he talks directly about what consciousness is. And that's obviously a very controversial topic. Some people say consciousness is so transparent we can't talk about it at all. But Husserl clearly thinks we can talk meaningfully about consciousness. And this would be the investigation where he does so. So the end game of pure logic, as Husserl construes it, is a theory not simply of meaning or grammar, but of truth and the possibilities of scientific knowledge. As the final preparatory step to addressing these issues, his fifth investigation endeavors to clarify what is common to meaning, perceiving, and knowing, namely consciousness. This is a long, I'm skipping over sections to summarize some of it. Husserl mentions three concepts of consciousness that he takes to be relevant. This is the 1901 version, so the first edition. We'll mention in a moment, he changed his mind a little bit about this. But the first meaning of consciousness is the entire real subsistence of the empirical ego. This is sort of what you would, if you remember Hume's treatise on personal identity, where he talks about how consciousness, things go in and out on the stage of experience, or the self is like a republic. There's representatives who come in and then get voted out of office. They come and go. Well, there's a temporal flow to it. Hume didn't say this, but this is the way Husserl ultimately understands the empirical ego. He picks up from William James the notion of it's a stream of consciousness. So it's the weave of mental experiences in the unity of a stream of consciousness. The second meaning of consciousness is the inner awareness of one's own mental experiences. So as I was outside in front of the place we're staying, I watched the people go by, and then I started looking at the facade of the school here, trying to figure out what all those things meant, if I could figure it out. So I was going from one object of consciousness to another, and I wasn't thinking about my consciousness of them at all. I was just looking at the passersby, looking at the facade. So that would be all part of what we normally understand as the empirical ego, this flow of states of mind, different contents of consciousness. But the second meaning of the ego for Husserl is the inner awareness of one's own mental experiences. So one way to see this would be as I looked at the facade, suddenly something reminds me of what I saw before I was looking at the facade. Now I am aware of my mental state through memory. I'm aware of having a moment ago looked at the passersby. So that would be the second meaning of the ego. And then the third meaning is every sort of mental act or intentional experience. So I'm going to try to quickly go through how he treats these different meanings of the ego and consciousness. So while consciousness in the first sense signifies the mere stream of consciousness of the empirical ego, including acts and contents empirically present and interconnected more or less, consciousness in the second sense signifies the ego's adequate perception of the contents of the empirical ego in their temporal unity. So I'm aware that I was first being conscious of passersby, then I was conscious of the wall. So I now have supposedly an adequate perception of the contents of the empirical ego in their temporal unity. So Husserl will emphasize this, the primal level of consciousness and ultimately of the ego is an internal time consciousness. It will be composed of retention, impressions, and protensions. The former, the first of which, the retention is not the same as memory, but makes memory possible. The protension is not the same as expectation, but it makes expectation possible. Okay, so he has this a rich notion of this temporal flow of the empirical ego. But the second sense of being having an adequate perception of the contents of the empirical ego is a gloss on the Cartesian cogito, because it's an adequate perception. The idea here would be that there's some kind of privileged access to my mental contents. This is controversial, but let's look at it this way. So when you look at this up here, you only see one side of it. And to have a better understanding, you have to, walk around and look at different sides of it, or have someone turn it around and show it to you. You don't have to, it's seemingly you don't have to do that with your experience of perceiving or your experience of dreaming. You're able to have an adequate perception of that mental state. So that's why this second sense is a kind of gloss in the Cartesian ego. The indubitability or adequacy of whatever contents reside in the empirical ego. Just as the stream of consciousness flowing from perception to memory to judgment, for example, the empirical ego presupposes the self-evidence or adequacy of the perception, the memory, and the judgment at each stage of the flow and in the flow itself. In this sense, the empirical ego presupposes the phenomenological ego intentionally constituting it. Okay. So you'd have to bracket the empirical ego, but you would be left with those contents, which supposedly you could have, you adequately perceive. Now, when Husserl wrote the logical investigations, and particularly this one, he had rejected the neo-Kantian position that there is an ego in consciousness, that the contents of consciousness are necessarily contents for an ego, where ego is something of which we are aware as the center of all relations of objects to it, without itself being an object. That's a gloss of Husserl's point, but I take it that what he's glossing there is the Kantian idea that the I think must be able to accompany all clear representation. But the claim he's making, he makes by 1913, is that there is such an ego to which all the contents of consciousness refer. So what he wrote originally is the following: I must confess that I can't find this primitive ego as a necessary center of relations at all. What I only take note of, what I only am in the position to perceive is the empirical ego and its empirical relation to its own experiences. But by the time he drafts Ideas I, he apparently found it, the ego that he couldn't see before. So this is a controversial point, both, well, what made him change his mind? Is there an argument that there must be a transcendental ego? Is it a conscient type argument? I'll put my cards on the table. I don't see it as convincing. My guess, but it's just a guess, is that we have states of mind or forms of consciousness that we don't attribute to ourselves. Kind of out there. We have them, but we don't necessarily say, well, I'm having this experience or this, or attributing it to ourselves. So that would go against this idea that all the contents of consciousness relate to an ego as the center of them. Now, Descartes says something like this. Remember, what's the famous thing about I am a thinking thing, a thing that thinks, dreams, remembers. You know, he had to list all those properties in the second meditation. You know, but the I is always there doing it. So anyway, this is one aspect of this investigation. I'm not so. I think it's a great investigation, by the way. His treatment of forms of consciousness are really very valuable for contemporary philosophy of mind. But on this particular point of the insistence on the ego, I'm not so sure. I guess, and I'm not doing this because of a Heideggerian impulse, although I think Heidegger would agree with me on this, because the being in the world issues of self, but there isn't necessarily the reflexivity of being in the world isn't the reflexivity of an ego. The ego comes later, section 64 in Being and Time. So anyway, enough said about that. That Husserl has changed his mind on this. Now, there's something else he does in the this investigation that we should mention. Probably the most important thing, and that is he critically appropriates Brentano's so-called foundationalist thesis. So when Brentano wrote the Psychology from an Empirical Standpoint, we talked about this last class, so we'll just repeat it, that the mark of the mental for Brentano is intentionality. So consciousness is always consciousness of something. Dreaming is always, there's something dream that is dreamt. Seeing, there's something seen that corresponds to the seeing. Thinking, there's a thought. So every act of the mind takes some kind of object or content. That's the intentional character of consciousness, according to Brentano. More or less, Husserl will be on board with something like that, except for sensations and pleasures and pains. I think we mentioned this last class, that for Brentano, my pain, which I actually have right now because I fell down some stairs, is right there. So the pain has an intentionality. It takes it as its object, its location. Husserl doesn't buy that. He thinks that, like Karl Stumpf, they break with their teacher here. They say there are pleasures and pains that aren't intentional at all. And there was a young lady in the class last time who said, well, what about moods? Moods further seem to be a problem for the Brentanian view. I mean, if moods are distinct from emotions, I know it's somewhat controversial, but if they are, they don't seem to be directed at an object the way the other emotions are. So anger is angry at someone, loving, you love someone. But if you're having anxiety, is it about something? Maybe, maybe not. It's not so clear. So those would be, I think, ways in which Husserl and Stumpf break with Brentano. But in general, the idea that the mark of the mental is intentionality is accepted by Husserl. But he does change it somewhat for some reasons we should pay attention to. So for Brentano, every act of the mind is a Vorstellung, or a judgment, or a matter of love and hate. This is translated by the Brentano crowd, and rightly so, I think, presentation. To avoid the problem of translating it as representation. So it seems that Kant would want this, and Leibniz would want us to say the Latin representatio is the right translation for Vorstellung, but Brentano doesn't seem to want us to think of it as a representation. And then this is judgment. And this is love and hate. So with this threefold distinction of the kinds of consciousness, Brentano claims that every, I'll say this correctly, every act of the mind is either a presentation or founded on a presentation. So what's present to you is that my cup is on the table, an intentional act. It presents something to you, and then you can judge that, yes, it is on the table. Or you can say, no, I'm hallucinating. But you make the judgment about something that's presented to you. And then, of course, it's when you get to love and hate, the object that's presented to you is something that you love, you wish to have, or you wish to be with, or something, or you're repulsed by. So that completes the whole panorama for Brentano. Okay? So Husserl will not disagree with this, but he distinguishes it because he thinks we need to distinguish between objectifying acts and non-objectifying acts. So in this context, Husserl will say that he'll accept Brentano's foundationalist thesis, but in terms of a distinction between objectifying and non-objectifying acts. What is an objectifying act for Husserl? It posits something or some state of affairs, whether in its absence or its presence. Non-objectifying acts depend on the objectifying acts, according to Husserl. So desire, fear, love, and hate all presuppose objectifying acts. But these emotions themselves are not objectifying. Which doesn't mean they're not still intentional. So here's an interesting place to see where Heidegger and Husserl come apart. So for Heidegger, and he thinks he's following Scheler, Pascal, and Augustine, that sometimes our emotional states determine what presents itself to us. It's not that first something is presented to me and then I love it or I don't love it. It's that precisely because I come at it with an emotional state that it then is something that presents itself to me one way or another. So there's a line from Augustine, non intra veritatem nisi caritatem. One doesn't enter into the truth except through love. There's some similar Pascalian moments there too. So anyway, this would be a different take on the role of emotions. Okay? But clearly, Husserl's view might strike some people as overly cognitivist, but then some people would say Heidegger's view is too non-cognitivist. It's assigning too much to what's irrational, which are at least not an objectifying act. Okay, you can see there's a lot of ways you could you could debate the foundational thesis. And so there's a great deal of back and forth between Husserlian scholars and Brentano scholars on this, the kinds of types of consciousness there are and how they're related to one another. It's really a fascinating discussion, and I've already mentioned the Gefühlsempfindung, so, okay. Now, come to the sixth logical investigation. The sixth logical investigation is entitled The Elements of a Phenomenological Clarification of Knowledge. We mentioned this last class, but it's worth iterating, emphasizing. The word here is clarification, Aufklärung, literally. And we know that where Husserl agrees with Brentano and with, of all people, Ernst Mach, and with Fender, is that descriptive psychology is not the same as genetic or explanatory psychology. So we're not trying to explain knowledge. We're trying to describe what goes on when we know. We're trying to clarify it. And that's true of Husserl's phenomenology in general. So even as he drops the word descriptive psychology, the idea here is not to give it an explanation. And this is, I think, you might call this the weakness of phenomenology, but it could also be described as its strength. Because for neuroscience to explain what's going on in my experience, I need a description of that experience, which is adequate. And if I bring in causal explanations before I give that description, I may distort the description. So there's a role for phenomenology, even in advanced neuroscientific investigations. What the hell are you explaining? What are those synapses accounting for if you're going to give the causal account? And that's something that all these figures we mentioned really were aware of. Even Dilthey, the 1899 essay on this distinction between descriptive and explanatory psychology. The common view then, and I think it still is the strength of phenomenology, to not too quickly jump onto the neuroscientific boat or the any psychological method boat, but first try to give a description as free from presuppositions as possible. What's going on? How are we experiencing things? Okay. No. Thank you. Should we take a break? Do you mind take a 5-6 minute break? I have a lot tonight, so I'm ready to go till 8 or thereafter. But okay, let's take a break.
Welcome back to this second part of today's lecture. Just a reminder for those of you who came in late, Professor Dahlstrom is available to meet with any of you who are interested in my office on the 4th floor on Monday morning from 10 to 12, depending on how many of you show up. Please.
Thank you. So this the sixth investigation is, in Husserl's own words, the most important in a phenomenological context, end quote. He brings the entire arsenal of distinctions developed in the previous investigations to bear on the themes of knowledge, truth, and categorical intuition. So clarification of these themes, knowledge, truth, and categorical intuition, constitutes the bulk of the investigation, the sixth investigation. To clarify knowledge phenomenologically is to give a description and not an explanation of it. That is to say, to construe it on its own terms. So clearly, he proposes the act of meaning something is involved in knowing. But it's certainly possible to mean something or to have something in mind without knowing it. Similarly, the act of perceiving or intuiting something is involved in knowing. But it is just as possible to perceive something in the sense of taking it in directly by way of sensations without knowing it. That seems clear, right? You can mean something and not know it. So meaning in the sense that you have it in mind. I'm thinking of what's going to happen in Gaza in the next week. I don't know what's going to happen, but the meaning of my act of intending it, of thinking about it, is an act of meaning, but it's not an act of knowing. And I could perceive something without knowing it. I could, that is to say, perceiving in the very elementary sense of a sensory perception. I see something that is colored, or I hear a certain sound, but that doesn't mean I know it. The perception is not the same as the knowing, so Husserl contends. Knowing is related in some sense to meaning and perceiving, but is not identical to either. In the case of knowing an object, the object cannot be absent in the sense in which it can be in the case of meaning. I'll repeat that. In the case of knowing an object, the object cannot be absent in the sense in which it can be in the case of meaning it. Nor can the object simply be present in the sense in which it can be in the case of having a mere sensation or perception of it. So as these brief remarks suggest, Husserl's account of knowledge in the sixth logical investigation is embedded in his wider analysis of empty and filled intentions. I hope I get this right. Every time I think about this, I always find myself stumbling over what's really fulfilled. We'll see, I think, the issue. So Husserl thinks that to every empty intention, where something is absent from us, but we mean it, we intend it, there corresponds the possibility of a filled intention, the presence of what was absent in the empty intention. This is, again, an issue where he and Heidegger come apart, but I'll put that aside. So, again, Husserl's idea is that every empty intention, every thinking about something, to it corresponds the possibility of that thing being present and the intention being filled. Empty and filled intentions are related to one another as the dependent parts or moments of a whole in which their identity, in some sense, is recognized. So there's going to be an identity here. Of the empty and filled intention. A relation between empty and filled intentions, and thereby correlatively the absence and presence of something, absence and presence of something, is characteristic of a wide range of activities. So it's not only in knowing that you have empty and filled intentions. For example, my wife and I are planning to go somewhere around Pisa in the next few days. That's an empty intention. The filled intention will be when we go, to wherever it is we're going to go. I may wish for rain. It's an empty intention. If I get rain, that's a filled intention. So it's not just knowing that has this empty and filled, but Husserl obviously puts it to work here. What fulfills the intention is absent in the empty intention and present in the filled intention. Thus, once again, the absence and presence of the object intended, of the object intended correlate directly with respective empty and filled intentions. At the same time, it's quite possible for the filled intention to be less than complete and distinct. So think of only getting some of the facts right about the properties of iron. In all such cases, the object is given to the filled intention, but not completely or distinctly, at least not in all cases, and not such that the empty intention is perfectly filled or realized. So there could be degrees of fulfillment, depending upon what we're investigating. Now, while Husserl's account of knowledge in terms of this structural relation between empty and filled intentions is given in the sixth logical investigation, he prefigures this account with his discussion of expressive acts or acts of meaning in the first logical investigation. An expression, as we saw, Ausdruck, is a sign that expresses a meaning. An expression requires a physical phenomenon and meaning-conferring acts, acts which lend that phenomenon meaning as part of a way of meaning or even simply relating to an object. Thanks to these acts, the expression is more than a mere verbal utterance. It means something, and because it means it, it refers to something objective. This objective something can, on one hand, appear actually present by virtue of accompanying intuitions, or at least represented, for example, in an image of fantasy. Where this takes place, some relation to objectivity is realized. Okay? So the filled intention could be, or typically would be, we would think a perception, but if we can't perceive it, we might be able to imagine it. And that will provide some degree of fulfillment too. Okay. This will be repeated in Ideas, section 4, the beginning. So in this way, in the first logical investigation, Husserl introduces the crucial distinction between empty and filled intentions. He is here, of course, discussing intentions of meaning. What do you mean? I mean such and such. In addition to both acts of our senses through which the expression appears as a verbal utterance and acts that lend meaning to these appearances, there are acts that, while not essential to the meaning-conferring acts, fulfill them. So he calls them Bedeutung erfüllende Akte or Bedeutungserfüllung. So these are acts that confirm, corroborate, or illustrate more or less adequately what was meant. So Husserl advises us accordingly of the need to distinguish the intended sense or meaning, the fulfilling sense, and the object that is referred to by that fulfilling sense. And again, that's previewed in the first logical investigation, as we've seen, but he takes this up again in the sixth as he contrasts acts of meaning with acts of perceiving in his analysis of knowing. The act of meaning or expressing something requires a verbalization or something similar on the part of someone who means something by the words, as well as an act of perception on the part of someone who wants to understand what is meant. But clearly the act of meaning is not an act of verbalizing, nor an act of perceiving simply. The act of verbalizing is possible without meaning anything by the words uttered. So this is, we talked enough, I think, about that earlier. While I can mean something in its absence, I cannot perceive it unless it is present. While the perception is related to the act of meaning, it does not bear the meaning. Even for a demonstrative pronoun, an indexical like this, and the individual object perceived here and now, the meaning lies in the act of meaning this object, pointing to it. The perception realizes the this is meant, but does not constitute it, determining but not containing it. The same holds for proper names. A proper name means the object, not in an attributional manner as a bearer of these or those characteristics, but rather, he says, without such conceptual mediation, as the very thing that itself is, just as the perception places it before our eyes. The meaning of the proper name lies, therefore, in an act of directly meaning this object, a meaning that fulfills itself solely through perception, provisionally through illustration and imagination, but is not identified with these acts of intention. So, I repeated myself there, probably bored to hear that, but I said it twice. I'm going to put on the board the distinctions. There's, first of all, the verbal expression. It's interesting, much of the sixth investigation does echo points made in the first investigation. There's already a preview of the empty field there. Secondly, the act of meaning. Now, typically, the act of meaning would be something we would do through the verbal expression, but we wouldn't want to equate the verbal expression, the physical words on the page there, with the act of meaning. The act of meaning has to come along to give the verbal expression meaning. Then there's the act of sensing or perceiving. I think if we wanted to be generous to Husserl, we would leave that one out. But it's not clear that there is an act of sensing in this context. So Merleau-Ponty, for example, says there's no such thing as a sensation, right? Heidegger says something similar. So, and I think Husserl would buy that criticism, but nevertheless, he does talk about sensing as well as perceiving here. And then fourthly, is the act of knowing. The act of knowing is distinct from the making the expression, the act of meaning, or the act of perceiving. Now here we start running into the delicate or nuanced part of his account. If knowing is neither meaning nor merely perceiving, it's also not simply the juxtaposition of the two. So knowing is not the same as meaning, and it's also not the same as perceiving, and it's not simply the conjunction or juxtaposition of the two. So what is it? It is the intuition of the identity of what is merely perceived with what is meant. He hasn't yet introduced the notion of categorical intuition, but it is in effect already a categorical intuition. It's an intuition because it's not a sensory intuition. I mean, if this is a St. Louis Cardinals cap, okay? It's a baseball team in St. Louis, in the US. So for you to know that this is the St. Louis baseball cap, it isn't enough for you to, that's what I meant by it, to mean it by it. And it's certainly not the same as to see it. Because when you see red and blue and you see a shape, but you don't see that it's identical to what I just meant. It's not a sensory intuition. That's what he will eventually call a categorical intuition in logical investigation. I intuit the identity between the statement, Dahlstrom has the Cardinals baseball cap in his hand, and the perception of the cap in my hand. But that identity that is perceived is this very distinctive kind of intuition, because it's not a color or a sound or a touch. I mean, what it's like is being. As we'll see in a moment, the categorical intuition also includes being, and this being is not a color, sound, or touch either. Okay, so his definition of knowledge is something like this. Knowledge is the identification of an object meant with an object perceived, where what is meant coincides with what is perceived. Metaphor. The German is Deckung. So this, it means if you took two shapes that were absolutely the same and you put them on top of one another, they would the one would completely cover the other, but no more. That would be a form of Deckung. So it's translated usually coinciding. So you have one shape that coincides with another, literally. And that's the metaphor used here, the coincidence of what is meant and what is perceived. You could also put it in language which I haven't talked about, but it's used by Husserl here. The matter of these qualitatively different acts coincide. So there's a discussion of matter as opposed to the quality of an act. So the quality of act refers to the kind of act this, so you could have an act of questioning, an act of remembering, an act of imagining, and you could have the same matter to each of those acts. So I could question the same thing that I remember and the same thing that I imagine. So in that case, the matter is the same, even though the quality of the acts is different. It's a quality matter distinction he makes earlier. So one way you could unpack what he means here is say that knowledge is where the matter of the act of meaning and the act of perceiving, though qualitatively different, coincide. In this way, Husserl distinguishes knowing from meaning and perceiving, even as he clarifies the rules of meaning and perceiving and knowing. Quote, in other words, what we characterize in relation to the acts of meaning or thinking, signifying and perceiving as fulfillment, what we characterize as fulfillment in relation to the objects on both sides, to the intuited object on the one side and the thought object on the other, to be expressed as experience of identity, consciousness of identity, or act of, these are his words, act of identification. The more or less perfect identity is the objective that corresponds to the act of fulfillment or that appears in it. So that's the I think it's a very powerful analysis of knowing, very powerful way to understand knowing, where one doesn't reduce knowing to sensory experiences because it doesn't seem to be the same as a sensory experience. And we don't want to say we know things simply because we think about them, simply because we mean them. So knowing does seem to include something meant, something thought, and it includes something that is also perceived or sensed. But it wouldn't be the object of the act of meaning or the act of perceiving. It would be the object of the act of perceiving their identity. That would be the identity of what is perceived and what is thought. Again, maybe more carefully put, the identity of the matter of what is thought and with the matter of what is perceived, the content of those two acts. Now, in a footnote, Husserl points to the pre-reflectiveness of this experience. This is an interesting point. The clarification that the identity coinciding is experienced, even if the conscious intention of identity, the relating identifying, is not. So you could say, I know that the baseball hat's in Dahlstrom's hand without being conscious of the identity according to which you say you know it. And you do know it because knowing it means the identity of those two. But you don't objectify the identity itself. So this, in a certain sense, it's pre-reflective. I'll repeat what he says. The identifying that is coinciding is experienced. So you experience knowing. Even if the conscious intention of identity, the relating identifying, is not, end quote. You may not want to follow that, but that's, accept that, but that's the line he's drawing here. Now, the act of sensing or perceiving could be replaced by imagining. I'm going to ask Professor Farhard to help me here for a moment, but if I'm not mistaken, the early Husserl understood imagination or Einbildungskraft as picturing. But then by the mid-1915 or later, it's not necessarily tied to picturing. Does that sound right?
Actually, it's in 1904 that he has the Bildbewusstsein concept as an inner distinction between an act based on a twofold distinction. So the demand and the Bildsubjekt and the Bildobjekt.
Okay, so then you don't after that, imagination doesn't require picture consciousness.
He starts distinguishing imagination from image consciousness in 1904.
Okay. So I'm just, thank you very much. So I knew there's a distinction there. And that's important to actually to see the possibilities of this point. So at one point, the German is Einbildungskraft, and that word Bild, meaning picture, is in the notion of imagination. So the early Husserl understood imagination as a picture consciousness, but he moved away from that. So sometimes and this is a distinction that's also made in, contemporary philosophy of mind, this distinction is made. So sometimes when we use the word imagination, we think that we're using it in a way to capture an image consciousness, picture consciousness. So imagine your mother. I'm imagining my mom right now, okay? And the picture is going across my mind. But I could also say, imagine what would happen if U.S. withheld armaments from Israel. It's not quite the same as thinking, but it's closer to thinking than it is forming an image. That's an ordinary use of the term imagine. Or it's this middle thing between thinking without any entertainment of the concrete state of affairs and perceiving it. So at any rate, however you're going to work that out, it's interesting here that there's a level of knowing that we can have, where in place of perceiving, we have imagining. And this is absolutely, I mean, this is really important. Think of what science is capable of only because it models things it studies. When we get to the micro level and the macro level, we need models. We need images. And we say we know something about the universe, or we know something about nanotechnology. But it's not at the level of anything perceived. It requires imaging. And that provides us with a certain degree of knowing. And Husserl makes that point here. He also does an Ideas one, as I said. Okay. So the sensing can be replaced by merely imagining, and then active knowing is affected accordingly. So Husserl here gives us a highly nuanced account of the dynamic and graded interplay of empty and filled intentions, presence, absence, and their identity. He recognized, in other words, that images, pictures, models, and the like play highly strategic roles in accomplishing a measure of knowledge. Okay, I think that's all I'm going to try to say about that. Any comments or questions about this analysis of knowing, this attempt to clarify knowing by Husserl? No? Okay. I'd say this has the longest legs of what he's written, this empty and filled intention as an analysis of knowing. It's very, very influential account. Okay, so there's one last thing that we need to talk about in the sixth logical investigation. There's others, but this one we need to mention, and that is his explicit discussion of categorical intuition. The word category is used here in a way which draws on logical categories. So he has that primarily in mind. So when he talks about categorical intuitions, which is, again, also in the sixth logical investigation, these intuitions, like others, are necessary components of knowing. So he talked about the empty and filled as a famous discussion, sections 36 to, I think, 40. If you read Heidegger's Being and Time, section 44, he refers to these sections on evidence and truth, empty and filled. But that comes before he explicitly talks about categorical intuitions, which seems to me is just a matter of, we can only do one thing after another. He could have maybe started with categorical intuitions and then given us the empty filled. But at any rate, categorical intuitions are a way, are figured into acts of knowing logical categories. So just think of the problem. How many, almost everyone here has studied philosophy, has studied logic, has studied baby logic. There's and, there's or, there's if then, there's negation. Where do these things get their validity? Is it just a practical discipline? We make it up. No, that doesn't seem right. Is it based on some norms? Well, even if it's based on norms, we saw earlier, but there has to be a theoretical discipline that explains why these things are trenchant, why there's a certain meaning to conjunction, to disjunction, to conditionals, to negation. Where do logical forms get their validity? And so Husserl's trying to answer that question here. He doesn't want to say that this is just a matter of thinking. Thinking isn't knowing. Could be wrong. And it's obviously, this is not something that's a product of perception. So the analysis of empty and filled intentions now plays a role, at least in his account, of categorical intuitions. So why did I say that? Maybe that was just flew by you like flew out of your heads like the birds in Plato there. Categories, logical categories include conjunction, disjunction, implication, so on. So the point here is, if we're trying to explain how logic and why logic works, we're going to need to know conjunction. We're not the properties of conjunction. You can't just think it. So this is an incredibly difficult thing to do. This is the challenge of, just think of logical investigations. What is that? How can you do that? Aren't you going to trip over your own logical feet? Aren't you going to be presupposing what you're trying to demonstrate? It's a really difficult prospect. Anyway, that's what's going on here with categorical intuitions. Okay, so it's again useful to keep in mind that this entire investigation aims at clarifying the elements of knowledge. And we already have a general model of that, the identity of empty and filled intentions. Okay, the point of departure for the discussion of categorical intuitions is the recognition that the fulfillment of an assertion about intuition is not the same as the fulfillment of its parts, this or that word. If the fulfillment of nominal meaning seems sufficiently clear to someone, then we pose the question of how the fulfillment of the entire assertion is to be understood. What should and can procure fulfillment for the moments of meaning, the moments of the categorical form, which constitute the form of the proposition as such, and to which, for example, the copula belongs? It is not sufficient to see the fulfillment of these additional meanings as mere parts of the entire perception of something. For example, the statement, "This paper is white," is fulfilled to some extent by the partial intuition related to the white part of the paper. So this is the assertion, "This paper is white." If we're going to say we know it, then we need to know what fulfills it. And it's not fulfilled simply by what fulfills the white part, seeing the whiteness. The statement includes far more. It states that the white that appears is recognized as white, and that the paper possesses the property of being white. Again, it's not a color or a sound or a touch, that the paper possesses the property of being white. The expressions "as white" and "being white" signify more than what corresponds to the part of the perception of the paper that is directed at the white part of it. This is all Husserl, so he uses this example. The direct, straightforward perception cannot accomplish the fulfillment of the significations of these terms. So Husserl distinguishes two sorts of intuiting. He distinguishes straightforward or sensory intuition, by virtue of which an individual object is identified and to which a name might correspond. So he distinguishes the word is Anschauung, and he claims that there are straightforward sinnliche, sensory intuitions. I think that we've already talked about how Merleau-Ponty wouldn't accept that, Heidegger wouldn't accept that. That there may be a problem here about thinking that you can identify Sinnesche Anschauung. Okay, I'll just leave that there. But he actually he's very clear about this. He calls them Schrägsinnige, which is straightforward or sensory intuitions. But since this paper is white isn't fulfilled by a sensory intuition, but it has a logical structure to it, he introduces the notion of a categorical intuition. So those are the two kinds of intuitions which he is working with here. So the same sentence may give expression to acts of intuiting founded upon that straightforward intention, acts that relate parts of the given object or in some way form them in which the expression is fulfilled. The difference in these two sorts of intuition parallels the difference between those parts of an assertion to which something directly corresponds in a sensory intuition and those parts to which nothing so corresponds. He calls these the material and formal elements of an assertion. So you have the sentence, got that word white in there, corresponds to supposedly sensory intuition. So you've got partial fulfillment, but you don't have the fulfillment of the whole sentence. This paper is white, which includes having the property of being white, which is a logical category. Okay. As a means of elaborating this distinction between kinds of intuition, Husserl cites Kant's principle, quote, being is no real predicate, by which Husserl insists is meant precisely what he is trying to clarify. Because we could also add the, the cap exists. What intuition does exist correspond to? What sensory intuition does it correspond? That's Kant's point. Being is not a real predicate. Kant has a distinctive meaning of real there, but don't need to go there now. So I can see the color, but I cannot see being colored. That's Husserl's words. I can feel the smooth, but not being smooth. I can hear the sound, but not being a sound. You kind of see why Heidegger liked this part of the logical investigation, the categorical intuition part. He's talking about being. Being is nothing in the object, not part of it, no moment dwelling in it, not quality or intensity, but also no figure, no inner form at all, no constitutive feature, however it might be construed. Being is also nothing on an object. It is no real inner feature, but also no real outer feature. And for that reason, no feature in the real sense at all. I'm wrapping up here. So it is also not a matter of the material forms of unity that connect objects to more encompassing objects. Colors, the compositions of colors, sounds, the harmonies, things, the more encompassing things, and so on. You can make the material parts of the proposition more and more complex, but you still aren't going to get what corresponds to the whole sentence. In an object of neither external nor internal perception, this is important. In an object of neither external nor internal perception, is it possible to locate or correlate to the meaning of being? Meaning of being. And other categorical forms, such as are expressed by one, the, and, or, if, then, all, none, something, nothing, as well as forms of quantity. No real object, that is to say, no object of any possible sentient perception corresponds to such expressions. So, if those expressions have a meaning, if they have a meaning that we know is operable in logic, there must be a categorical intuition. That's the argument he's adding here. Now, there's another way of treating these features, and that comes from John Locke. And Locke would argue that the meanings in question spring from reflection on certain mental acts. So this domain of inner sense would be the source of the logical categories. Husserl responds to this. The domain of inner sense is indeed the source of concepts such as perception, judgment, affirmation, negation, combining and counting, presupposing and inferring. So we know what these are by reflecting on our mental states. We have to make judgments, to be sure, in order for us to be able to grasp being. Similarly, acts are necessary for the objective correlates of expressions of other categorical forms. But the forms, the categorical forms, are not given to us in the reflection on the acts. Not in the reflection on the judgments, or rather on the fulfillments of judgments, but rather in the fulfillments of the judgments themselves does the origin of the concepts, states of affairs, and being, in the sense of the copula, genuinely lie. Not in these acts as objects, but rather in the objects of these acts do we find the foundation for the abstraction, a foundation of the abstraction for the realization of the mentioned concept. I went through that probably too quickly, but there is this empiricist alternative here. Where do the logical forms come from? They come from reflection on our own mental acts. Husserl's comeback is, yes, you need to reflect on yourself to know what judging is, inferring is, and so on. But the categorical forms that govern these are not given to us by reflection on the acts. In fact, they're presupposed by reflection on the acts. Okay. Real quick, categorical intuitions are not confined to intuitions of logical forms. There are, in the first place, sheer statements of fact to which categorical intuitions must correspond. These would be things like states of affairs. So this is, I think this comes from Stumpf, the concept of state of affairs, is then used by Wittgenstein as well as Husserl as a constant category of formal ontology. In the second place, there are statements typically made in science that take something ideal in general as their object. For example, some mathematical axiom, the addition of any two integrals yields an integral. To these acts of meaning, too, there must be corresponding intuitions that are founded upon the straightforward intuitions, but for which the objects of the straightforward intuitions serve merely as examples of the ideal generalities. So I didn't go through this, but the categorical intuitions, he claims, build on the sensory intuitions. So they don't, you couldn't simply add them up and get the categorical intuitions, but the categorical intuitions build on them. So let's take back the other example. The cap is on the table. From the standpoint of ontology, that's a state of affairs. That state of affairs is the logical category that corresponds to the sentence, the cap is on the table. Now, the cap being on the table is known in part because of the color, because of the background. So there will be sensory intuitions that form a supposition for the category. If we get rid of these, we're going to have a different way of understanding. And that's something that Merleau-Ponty and Heidegger both do. Heidegger gives, I think it's Logic, the Question of Truth, 1925. He gives a very positive reading of Husserl's account of categorical intuitions, but he does it by completely leaving these out. And it's again that same impulse that Merleau-Ponty has. Where's color? You have a burgundy shirt on. I don't see just the burgundy. I see it as part of this unity, this complex. So it seems like we're always, even when we perceive sensorily, we're perceiving states of affairs. So Husserl, but is still relying on somehow building up the categorical intuitions from the sensory. My colleague Walter Hoppe, he thinks that this is too much Brentano. Brentano's empiricism is still staying with him. I don't know if that's the case, but you can see why. Okay. Are there any comments or questions? Yes.
Essential elements, such as pure abstract object as mathematical.
Could you repeat the question one more time, please?
Also, can you speak louder, because people at home not hear you? We don't have a microphone. Or then, well, okay.
And how does someone form a categorical intuition towards something that without essential aspects, such as mathematical elements?
As I understand him, that the mathematical proposition that A plus B is identical to B plus A.
The mathematical structure as rings, forms, but rings.
Oh, you mean, okay. Well, I think we want to distinguish two levels, but I don't think it's unfriendly to your point. We probably want to distinguish ideal mathematical relations or properties. And then we would want to distinguish that from their realization, reported realization in nature. In both cases, you would need something more than a sensory intuition. You need something like a categorical intuition, because you've got a structure there that isn't given by the senses. And that would be true in mathematics or applied mathematics. I don't think so. Husserl clearly doesn't think so. But it's the problem is the way one understands the sensory intuition. Do they stand on their own? And so maybe some of you know this better than I do, but part of Merleau-Ponty's criticism is drawn from Gestalt psychology. So you don't have the kind of Humean account of discrete colors, sounds, and touches. We don't experience the world that way. We experience these colors, sounds, and touches in a certain structure or with certain shapes. And once we've done that, we've moved beyond just the sensory. And we have to bring in some other way of talking about it. And we could still use the empty-filled distinction. We could still say that there's a way in which we know, these properties of mathematics or these exemplifications of mathematical properties in the world through perception, always needed, but the perception alone isn't enough. We need to perceive the identity of the perception with what the theory tells us we're we're looking at.
Sometimes we have the perception of this collection of properties, properties, other than the sensory representation in the real world.
Yeah, I mean, it's a common observation many people make all the time. Triangles don't have to be red or blue. I mean, that's irrelevant to the geometer's study of them. And yet there are fulfilling intentions for what are the properties of triangles.
What if it doesn't exist in real life? It's just based on our imagination or some
yeah, I think
conceptual.
I mean, possible worlds, there would be some degree of confirmation. Yeah. So Kant apparently conceived of the possibility of alien life, and one of the motivations for a morality based on a rational principle rather than a human principle is to be able to act morally in relation to creatures who have different sensory powers, if they have sensory powers at all, but different kinds of beings. Sure, I mean, I think we can imagine that, and we can have some degree of knowability of those possible worlds that don't exist in this, don't show up in this world at all. So, but that would still be some degree of fulfillment of what is completely thought out. Does that help? No, probably missed it, but.
If anybody from home or wherever you are wants to interject, and you just raise your hand or you open your microphone, please.